want to talk about how we can use stories to transform the power structures in which we work, we live, we think, and we care for one another. So I'm very aware that I stand here courtesy of several vectors of power in which, as my work as a feminist scholar, I seek to dismantle, disrupt, and to challenge these vectors of power. And I want to begin by thinking about three of these vectors. First, I stand here as someone employed by a research institution in the global north. Like many institutions in the global north, this is an institution that has benefited for decades, centuries, from exploitative colonial practices in terms of research and funding. Newcastle University also has its origins in Armstrong College, an institution named after Lord Armstrong, who was a 19th century global arms dealer who sold weapons to enable conflict and exploitative colonial practice around the world. He also became a peer, a lord, thereby part of another pernicious patriarchal institution, that of the Houses of Parliament in the United Kingdom. While many institutions are seeking to address their complex histories in terms of colonialism and power, it remains a fact that centuries of academic endeavor in the global north have been sustained by these exploitative colonial practices. And I would argue that this continues with the marketing of our degrees to international students at a higher tuition rate, something which supports the teaching of our home students. The second vector of power is the discipline in which I work. My own research and teaching, as Mahisha has said, is broadly concerned with feminism, bodies, phenomenology, and genre. But I work in a field that wears its colonial and intellectual predatory history on its sleeve in terms of its title, English literature. This is now shorthand for any and all literature, and increasingly film, television, and video games published in any Anglophone and some other countries. All of this is English literature, even if speaking of mid-19th century translations of Indigenous women's work in Canada, for example, or an English-speaking television show in Singapore, all English literature. The third vector of power is as an editor of Feminist Theory, a journal that is part of the broader landscape of academic publishing, a landscape which is now marked by neo-capitalist predatory publishing practices. We all do the academic labor, and we've been hearing about the kind of challenges of publishing and perishing. But we do this academic labor to produce academic papers for these publishers to sell back to our institutions for huge sums. We act as gatekeepers of knowledge, and I stand here, therefore, as someone complicit in these structures of power and knowledge, structures that have sustained particular modes of thinking, ordering, and reading. And these modes have privileged some groups and individuals. So I want to unpack some of this today and to think about how, as a feminist, we can disrupt, challenge, and dismantle some of these power structures. When I begin to think about these structures of power, I was struck the fact that my own area of research is often about people and social movements, but is mediated by books and often accessed through archives. So there are layers of removal here from the object of study to think about how we might make these challenges. And I want to use, however, books and archives, or the idea of them, as a launching point today to pose some provocations to think about labor, about patriarchy, about reading, and about radical acts of care. So, first up, labor. And we've been hearing a lot about this in the last panel. And I'll be talking primarily about higher education, as this is the field in which I work, but much of what I'm saying here is applicable to other fields. So the first thing to note is something that senior female colleagues warned me about when I was doing my PhD, and I now find myself warning my own female PhD students about this. It's about the duties of care that fall to women in higher education, primarily the care of students, the emotional burden of caring for students, and the ways in which emotional and intellectual care are bound up in ways that are very difficult to unpick, and that often get shifted to women in a department. The second, as we've heard already, is the focus on things that are valued in contemporary academia, and these are increasingly around accolades, prizes, fundings, awards, promotions, and increasingly in a world obsessed with celebrity and social media in terms of public self-presentation. Is there a place in academia for the feminist self-doubter? Is it a feminist enterprise to subvert these things, the neoliberal me-ness that is inflicting itself upon academia? Or could we see it as a feminist enterprise to work the system, to gain all these things, with an eye to heightening the research profile of feminism more generally? So I want to give an example of how this works by thinking about some of the things that I do as an editor of feminist theory. And talking to friends and colleagues who are on editorial boards of other journals, I'm not alone here in what I'm about to say. So an academic article is submitted, it's sent out to 2 or 3 reviewers for comments, and this practice of anonymous peer review has been at the heart of academic rigor, academic worth for well over a century. But now, it is often near impossible to find reviewers because, quite simply, the act of reviewing, or as I would see it, the act of care for the profession, is not worth very much at all in higher education, despite paradoxically so much of its assessment of value being predicated upon the notion of peer review. So the labor of peer review no longer has a place in academia. It is work that is shoved to the edges and devalued, and it's increasingly, in my experience, the work that junior women feel that they ought to pick up to help care for their profession, but they often simply do not have the time to do so. Promises are made that a review will be returned, and sometimes we have to wait 18 months to get a review back. We might have to ask 40 people to review a single paper. But the article that is waiting to be reviewed is the output that someone needs to get ahead in their career to get promoted. So you can see the catch-22 situation here. You're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. We've had numerous inquiries from scholars about our impact factor, and because we have a reasonably high one in women's studies, rather than in English literature, say, there are some people who therefore will not submit an article to feminist theory because it's ranked in women's studies. We've had people pull their article because the impact factor has changed the course of a year, and by this I'm talking from 18.7 to 18.5, and it means that they will not get promoted. But the way to get the impact factor higher is for a journal to have it cited more by others. And so we have to enter into this kind of rat race of chasing after big names in order to get them to publish. And to be brutally honest, we've had excruciating discussions about whether we should accept a pretty weak piece with poor reviews by a big name or a strong piece with good reviews from an unknown scholar, because the former will get cited more often. And I'll come back to this point about citations in a bit. The publisher also pushes us to revise the titles and keywords of all accepted articles because, and I'm quoting here an email, it doesn't matter if the articles are read, it's the hits that matter on social media. So where is the value of intellectual labor here? And how might we as feminists rise to these challenges in higher education? Can we turn the act of doubt into something subversive? And I want to think more about these questions and thinking about the pedagogical challenges and political ambitions of feminist theory. So to do that, I want to return to spring 2020 and to the COVID lockdowns that were enacted globally. After the novelty of the shock wore off, I began to chafe, as many did, at being confined to my house. And I was chafing not just at being limited to the house, but not having any choice in terms of my engagement with my own living space. There was no escape from my 4 walls, and I know that I was very fortunate in having 4 walls and being able to manage my bills, but there was no escape from the 4 walls, and as a single mother, from being responsible for the entire care of my children during that time. The public-private divide was being writ large upon many domestic spaces around the world that were under lockdown. And in fact, what many people were experiencing is what women across the centuries and around the world have lived. Lack of choice, lack of movement, fear of a possible danger in moments that one could go outside, and the total responsibility for management of domestic matters. Now, we can nuance this and say that globally during lockdown, women were shouldering far more of the domestic management and labor, and that incidences of domestic violence against women were on the rise. And I acknowledge this burden of knowledge and I despair. But I also posit that the general conditions of lockdown, in confining us to the private domestic spaces created by the discursive structures of patriarchy, had many people globally experiencing the conditions of the private life that women have been experiencing in cultures and society for millennia. This association between women and the domestic and the interiority of women's lives is a long-standing focus in the study of women. And how might thinking about this longer history of women being restricted and contained help us think about radical change? This brings me to the second point about lockdown. In the UK, during lockdown, there was a proliferation of journalistic pieces along the lines of the productive uses to which you can put lockdown. So learning how to make the perfect lentil doll. You could write a radio play. You can finish off those sewing projects. You could perfect a yoga handstand. Putting aside the rhetoric around usefulness and productivity here, I found that my yoga handstand did not improve. It did not get off the ground. But I, along with millions of people around the world, did something more during lockdown that binds us together as humans. And what was that? It was reading stories. Sales figures indicate that book sales rocketed globally during lockdown, and that since then we have remained buying more than we were doing pre-lockdown, and that the use of libraries, despite their closure in many parts of the world, has also gone up post-COVID. In short, we are reading, reading, reading. Reading is what we have as human. It's what marks us as different. We tell stories to ourselves, about ourselves, over and over again. We have entire industries built on reading, on books. Every school is built on the act of reading. I want to turn here to the work of Donna Haraway, who talks about something she calls compost writing. And she calls upon a kind of bio-environmental metaphor. Nothing makes itself, nothing tells its own story. Stories nest like Russian dolls inside ever more stories and ramify like fungal webs, throwing out ever more sticky threads. So the question of why we read is just as important as what we are reading. What we turn to for reading gives us a sense of who we are and why we are. This is why reading matters. To bring this back to higher education, however, there are paths to be traced in our individual and collective reading practices which explain who we are institutionally. And I want to think about the power of our citation methods and processes. And I'm also standing here and I'm very aware that my citations come from a particular kind of segment of kind of feminist theory published in the global north. Very happy to be challenged on this and to kind of learn more from all of you. Evidencing what we read is a way of indicating what we have read and endorses that act of reading for others. There's also the question of who is able to read, both literally and figuratively, who has the space to read. The exclusionary practices of reading tell us a great deal about who we are and why we are as well. In her recent work on the labor of diversity work, Sara Ahmed talks about the exclusionary practices of research, the processes of what is selected to be read, and what is promulgated within the higher education institution, and how this is part of the building up of power structures, which many of feminist scholars are seeking to dismantle. So as Ahmed has it, use becomes usable as evidence. And when citation becomes an index, other things follow. The more he is cited, the more evidence of impact, the more value to an organization, the more time he is given to do his work, the more he writes, the more he's cited. Endless circle. So thinking here, as Ahmed has it, how different forms of labor tend to fall on different bodies. Who is doing the work and who is making the decision? How is that work made visible? And how can we ensure that stories are told that need to be told, and how to uncover the stories that haven't yet been read? We turn to the novelist Ali Smith. She reminds us that books need time to dawn on us. It takes time to understand what makes them structurally in thematic resonance and afterthought, and always in correspondence with the books which came before them, because books are produced books more than by writers. They're a result of all the books that went before. On first reading, this seems a fairly obvious point, that books take time to fill our hearts and minds. But there's an important point that Smith is making about how books are the result of all the books that went before them. And this brings us back to Ahmed's point about citation, who gets remembered for their work. So as a brief example, I want to mention Eleanor Glyn. I'm curious, has anyone heard of Eleanor Glyn? So Glyn, focus of some of my own research. Glyn is probably the first global bestseller in the world. She wrote a novel in 1907 called 3 Weeks. It has an older woman who tutors a younger man about desire and pleasure. A novel that attracted a great deal of attention at time in terms of debates about morality. It preceded or enabled the entire history of Mills and Boon, Harlequin romances, 50 Shades of Grey, novels of Jackie Collins. The kind of impact of Glyn is far-reaching. She was selling millions and millions of copies in 1910, 1920s. She's been completely forgotten by literary history. And why is that? Well, I'd argue it's because she was regarded as a threat to the myth of women's sexual purity and was often disparaged critically. In other words, it was a story that was told and then forgotten because of structures of power. There are thousands of stories like this, and the work of feminist scholars and thinkers must be to uncover and recover these stories. The third and final point I want to make is about how we should read. In the past 20 years, Anglophone feminist theory has begun to consider how to pull in the somatic and emotional foci of the debates on affect and emotion into other long-standing concerns of feminism: labor and inequity, the public-private divide, gender, the means of production, and violence. More recently, the turn to affect has been mobilized in discussions which also draw on these long-standing concerns about the purpose and function of the university in the 21st century. This is particularly pertinent in the global north, as the far-right global attack on the humanities has resulted in the ongoing closure of many departments, degrees, and in all likelihood, institutions will be closing, certainly in the UK, within the next 2 years. Some institutions, not all institutions. One component of these discussions about the new university in the global north is the resistance of neoliberalism, with which those of us who've been in higher education for more of a decade are drearily familiar. Metrics, key performance indicators, repeated iterations and adjustments to strategic plans, workload allocation and management models, the rise of middle manager positions, or what are known as the deanlets and the deanlings, branding exercises, and the shifting parameters of what is understood by liberal neoliberalism to be the core business of higher education. This is something we see replicated in other institutions, NGOs, charities, businesses. It's the neoliberal hustle. Is it a feminist act to challenge this neoliberal hustle? And can reading help us to do this? My provocation for you here is how we might think of reading as an act of radical care for ourselves, for our disciplines, for our institutions, for our communities. Can the act of reading always be feminist work, part of the dismantling work? And how will this work within existing power structures? So if we think about care in a collective capacity, we can think about it as a feeling with, rather than, as Hobart and Nice has, for others. When mobilized, it offers visceral, material, and emotional heft to acts of preservations that span a breadth of localities. Care is a collective capacity to build an alternative to colonialism and capitalism. Can we work collaboratively to resist the transformation of reading and research from a contributor to human knowledge to just that revenue stream that universities want it to be? The question of who does what kind of reading and what kind of work is central to this. So thinking about radical care as a foundation for a better world. I would suggest that we might need to think mycologically. Now, fungi have tubes which link plant roots at the cellular level. Plants are joined together in a sustaining and sustained network. And we are all sustained by organic and phatic connections which invigorate our work. Like mycological environments, these are not often immediately visible, but are tremendously important. So thinking here about what Lynn Segal is saying, how webs of interdependence place questions of care at the heart of everything that we do in terms of thinking about seriously progressive thought. And thinking about how storytelling can be a productive tool in communicating difficult concepts, evoking empathy, or spreading awareness of experiences and losses. With the reworking of these stories comes the reworking of notions of futurities, a way to reframe attitudes towards the future to include and center other ways of knowledge. Donna Haraway argues that in the face of anthropogenic destruction, it's essential that we focus on forging entanglements and making kin with other beings, both human and non-human. She argues that, quote, staying with the trouble requires making collaborations, combinations, and entanglements situated in material semiotics and connections. What I would say, making space for stories. And as Robin Wiegman has it, how do you know when an analysis is done? When you have a different story to tell. But how do you know when the story is different? And that's the challenge for all of us feminist scholars. Because it matters what stories tell stories. It matters what matters we use to think other matters with. It matters what stories we tell other stories with. It matters what knots not knots, what thoughts think thoughts, what descriptions describe descriptions, what ties tie ties. It matters what stories make worlds and what worlds make stories. We can make change and we can make transformation, and I would say that that is our feminist challenge. We all need stories and we can do this together. Thank you.